My presentation will be brief. It's entitled "The Sacrament of Marriage is What Transforms a Nation." There could hardly be a less controversial statement in the setting of our conference, I suppose, than this. The family is the cornerstone of a flourishing society. What we mean by family matters, of course. A society takes its form from the families that make it up, like a fundamental element takes its properties from its distinctive atoms. Our solidarity-starved civilization, for instance, takes its form from families that have been too often fractured beyond recognition. A healthy and enduring society, on the other hand, takes its form from a particular kind of family culture, one where men and women make and keep lifelong covenant commitments which create not just thriving nuclear households, but complex networks of extended families across place and time. If the microscopic structure of our current society is mostly isolated atoms, scarcely bonded to others, the structure of a Christian culture, a sacramental society, is a matrix of atoms, a family of families, whose intricate interdependency gives society strength and resilience. Thus, there is no relationship on which society depends more than the bond between husband and wife. This is the primordial bond, the first society, without which all others disintegrate. Christian advocacy for a family-centered society has almost without exception focused on marriage as a natural institution. And there have been good reasons of principle and strategy for doing so. Marriage is a natural institution, and recognizing it as such is a necessary part of restoring the public understanding of its bond. As Pope Pius XI affirmed in his encyclical letter on Christian marriage, Casti Connubii, the essential duties of marriage aren't just applicable to religious marriages, but to all properly executed marriages. In an era of secular states and secular politics, focusing on natural marriage has also made sense practically. Arguing that the truth about marriage is accessible and practicable by public reasons, to use a Rawlsian term, was essential to campaigns for state recognition of the truth about natural marriage. We're all acclimated to the idea that only secular arguments are permissible in the public square, and so those are the arguments most Christian advocates make. As a result, we've argued ourselves into assuming that strictly natural marriages, that is, marriages contracted without the benefit of the sacrament of matrimony, are sufficient to give society an enduring strength and structure. But this may be a semi-Pelagian illusion, another lie of liberalism, which only serves to obscure the essential role of divine grace and sacramentality in human life and the social order, one that also leads to the foreclosure of family solidarity, to the bankrupt institutions of secularism. Indeed, it shuts down the kind of fundamental critique of postmodern Western civilization that this very moment calls for. In sum, we don't just need to return to a culture of natural marriage, we need to return to a culture of sacramental marriage. Perhaps the main question dividing Christian political thinkers at this time of crisis, though rarely articulated just so, is this: how deep must our critique of the present order go? Did a contagion infect an otherwise wholesome liberalism, turning it into a cruel caricature of itself? If so, when did it happen? The 60s, the 20s, earlier? And if not, must we say that liberalism was doomed from the beginning? Or just American-style liberalism? Maybe it's Locke's fault, Luther, Machiavelli, Occam. It quickly becomes a very frustrating parlor game. The pileup of competing meta-narratives of secularization, though, has been fruitful in at least one respect. Our digging through the history of Christian thinking about liberalism has churned up to the surface the fundamental insight that no political and social order, liberalism included, can be sustainable unless it is based not just in Christian morality, but in the practical virtues of the people. It's one of those statements that feels so obvious when it's laid out, but it is easily forgotten by a people living in times of peace and prosperity, when the institutions and norms of the political order seem to be humming along just fine on their own. Then one day they aren't humming along any longer, and we wonder what went wrong. And we realize the deficit of virtue, but too often we stop short in our analysis. The kinds of virtues that sustain societies Generosity and justice, prudence and love, and so on, do not emerge and propagate in a vacuum. They are first and most importantly products of grace, the result of a transformational movement of God's Spirit in our souls. To say that societies need virtue is to say that societies need grace. Just as virtues propagate through society, so is grace communicable, so that as Christ himself is to us, we can be Christ to others, instruments of grace. He sanctifies us, and he can use us to sanctify others through us. Systematic treatments of the role of grace in the political order are uncommon in contemporary Christian discourse. At least in part, this seems to be because the topic of grace necessarily implicates doctrinal divisions among various communions, and so we end up treating grace as more or less arbitrary, unaccountable splashes of divine favor, something we know is important but that we can't actually account for in our political thought. In the Catholic understanding, however, this is deficient. It is true, of course, that we can't audit God's grace as if it were laid out on a balance sheet. His gratuity is not governed by any set of rules we could possibly devise. But that doesn't mean we know nothing about how grace comes into the world. If that were the case, the sacraments would just be hopeful rituals rather than the genuine eruptions of heaven on earth. That prolepsis, that here and now manifestation of a hoped-for future, takes place every time a sacrament is performed, every baptism, every absolution, every confirmation. These are moments when the veil is pulled back and the fullness of reality, the human and the divine, the earthly and the heavenly, is revealed and experienced by humans. These are the moments when the hoped-for future is shown to be already all around us, especially in the life of the church. Thus, we can say that humans are not just social animals, but indeed ecclesial animals. We are made for and naturally have relationships not just with other human beings, but with our Creator, our Redeemer, with Christ and his church. There's no way around it. The question is whether we as individuals and as societies will recognize and grow that relationship or ignore it and let it atrophy. The question is whether we will embrace the sacramental nature of society or cede and surrender it to the secularism and the liberalism of the postmodern world. This sacramental society isn't so much a far-off ideal that we should seek to create as it is a reality with which we should cooperate. The mystery of Christ and his mystical body, not the dialectic, not materialism, not progress, and not the free market, is the fundamental principle of history and social order, the fixed point around which we organize our lives and our communities. But we must then ask ourselves, does our political and social order make it possible to cooperate with this reality? Or does it actively deny the role of grace and the church, thus creating the condition for its own demise? The very best we can say for liberalism is that it generally will not interfere with the autonomous individual's pursuit of perfection through grace. And this is not nothing, certainly when compared to totalitarian regimes of the past and the present. But it's also, in a real and important sense, a denial of reality. Growth in virtue and sanctity through sacramental grace is not just a subjective lifestyle choice, like becoming a vegetarian. It is objectively the calling of every human person from his Creator. The idea that the civil authority should be neutral between authentic sacraments and their parodies, between the life of grace and the life of vain self-reliance, is incoherent, amoral, and ultimately self-defeating. In the name of freedom, we create slaves to desire. For there is no standing still in the journey to God. We are either advancing with his grace or falling behind without it. Liberalism also cannot recognize in any meaningful way that divine grace functions corporately as well as individually. By healing, elevating, and perfecting our human nature, grace brings both individual persons and communities to share in a heavenly perfection that we were made for, one that is present even now among the angels and saints. Most importantly for our purposes, matrimonial grace makes the extraordinary responsibilities of natural marriage possible. It's not that every marriage that does not benefit from the sacrament will collapse or be riven by unfaithfulness. Rather, it's that grace and only grace can preserve us from the day-to-day corrosion of the basic vices of close relationships: lust, pride, selfishness, envy, and fear. Only grace can keep a family's momentum moving. Without that grace, no matter how peaceful and prosperous a marriage might appear, there is always that potential for deep regression. And as marriage goes, so goes society. Who can deny the evidence? It's not just the data on family formation and fracturing. It's the data on civil society and solidarity. It's stagnant wages and expanding inequality, and collapsing labor force participation, and growing ranks of managers and executives who feel no responsibility whatsoever for the well-being of those beneath them in the corporate depth chart. It's identity politics, but it's also the breakdown of solidarity, of the notion that we have duties that we didn't choose, of any sense that our good in the natural and the supernatural realm might be connected to those of those around us. It's certainly true, but perhaps rather trivial, to say that all of this is the result of a collapse of virtue. That's like saying your team lost because it scored fewer points than your opponents. What truly matters are the prerequisites, the conditions of possibility, a social order that cannot account for grace, specifically that cannot account for the fact that the Church of Christ is the medium through which divine grace enters the world, has signed its own death warrant. The idea of a sacramental society invariably tempers our expectations for what is possible under liberalism. If the incorporation of the truth of sacramental grace is essential to the sustainability of a social and political order, then that means giving pride of place to the church in a way that is simply impossible under the rubrics of liberalism. But that doesn't mean quietism or worse, despair. It means we should be thinking about what a sacramental society might look like in the 21st century and beyond. And so there's hopefulness in this vision that goes beyond the horizons of liberalism. It offers a genuine and exciting expansion of our understanding of what is possible for human life. This isn't immanentizing the eschaton, as the cliché response to any non-liberal political program goes, but recognizing what we already have in the infrastructure of grace, that is the church. It is a vision of hope for what human communities can be, with the help of grace, at a moment of despair over the possibility of living together in peace. We can't create heaven on earth by ourselves, but we already have it at every Mass, at every baptism, in every sacramental celebration. The question is not just what can we reasonably expect to accomplish without grace, but rather what are we going to do with it? While the church can never coerce someone into receiving the grace of God that comes through the sacraments, nonetheless, treating the sacraments as nothing more than peculiar sectarian beliefs or ritual ornaments, or take them or leave them spiritual accessories, is definitely not a necessary or expedient compromise, much less a useful accommodation to pluralism. Rather, it is a denial of reality, both human and divine. Grace is for everyone, and everyone needs it. The church is for everyone, and everyone needs her. Christ is for everyone, and everyone needs him. We owe him our worship, and in turn we accept and cooperate with the divine assistance and power that we need to bring peace into our marriages and families, and to sustain justice on earth. Without the former, the latter is impossible. The grace of the sacrament of matrimony is real. It's powerful. It's beautiful. Indeed, it is what makes marital fidelity possible and family solidarity sustainable. Not easy, to be sure, much less automatic, but truly transformational and sanctifying, personally and politically. Thank you.
It's a great honor to speak on this panel today, which is titled On the Perfect Society. And so I want to say a few words on that term, the perfect society. Perfect in what sense? Someone will raise the specter of scandals and sins of laymen, religious priests, and bishops in the lower parts of the church as soon as you mention the phrase perfect society. But these betray a misunderstanding about the nature of the church and what it is. Perfect society is how the church speaks about herself in a specific sense, namely that the church bears the illuminating and purifying fire of divine charity itself upon its altars. The church carries the purifying and perfecting power of Christ which leads us to happiness, the happiness that those men on their porches long for in mills that will not come back or may not come back. When we say perfect society, this does not mean that other societies are full of sinners and the church militant isn't. That would be absurd. What it means is that the church is full of sinners just like every other society, but they have hope. The perfective difference in the perfect society is that sinners can become saints. The church on pilgrimage has this power of purification and perfection, not only for individual souls, though, not only for some libertarian spiritualism in which we each get our own private Idaho, but rather it is good for cities. It is good for those who sit on their porches. It is good for those who form families. It is good for entire nations, and even, dare I say, empires. The perfect society, thus, is the one society amongst all the societies that has the elevating power, the power to unite us to our final end, which is God. We know that when we offer ourselves to Him at the altar, He pours out these graces upon us, so that we may be united. We long for that unity, not only the unity with one another, but we long for unity with God, and this is only possible through the perfect society. For this reason, the Basilica of the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception, where I teach, on the campus of Catholic University, you'll find 80 side chapels in the shrine. And those side chapels are all dedicated to the presence of the perfect society in different nations, where there's been Marian apparitions, where there have been saints, where there have been martyrs. And in each of those side chapels, you have perpetual prayers offered for those nations, because the perfect society is an elevating society, a society that people look to with hope. And in each of those side chapels, you see what the church is in the world. It is that society that follows Christ's command to make disciples of all nations. You don't need the words post-liberal or based integralism to understand this, but that's what it is. And I want to state this as the fundamental premise of our discussions here, that our nation is wounded. All nations are wounded, just like all souls are wounded, and in need of those graces that Professor Hahn talked about, need of those graces which flow to the whole world from the altar of Christ. Now, this fact has always made the church a sanctuary for souls and cities alike. Less than 100 years after Emperor Constantine ordered Catholic basilicas and shrines to be built in Rome, they became places of refuge for Romans seeking sanctuary from invading hordes. The Catholic Church not only set the standard for charitable giving, but also the cooperation of state power became both a spiritual and material safety net, a sanctuary, if you will, at the beating heart of the empire. This did not make Rome itself, the empire itself, into a perfect society, but its openness, its ordering openness to the perfect society, to the material support that was given to the church, gave Rome elevating powers, the powers which were demonstrably good in temporal and material terms, as well as spiritual and eternal ones. Now, this all brings me to the central prompt that we were all given in our panel, is how do we address the material questions that face us, the men on their porches waiting for the mills to return? How do we face those questions, which are questions with a human face, without collapsing into materialism? I already alluded to the church as this makeweight against an entropic propensity to disorder human history. But it is precisely the perfect society that is a makeweight against materialism. For the sake of argument, let's say that it's going to take a while for this nation to be united to the perfect society. What other bulwarks do we have against materialism? What other helps do we have to move people towards grace, towards a civic happiness? The first, I would say, is a public ordination to God. This is actually something which is within the American tradition. We have it on our money. We have it on buildings. The public ordination to God is something that has suffered badly in recent decades, but it is easily restored. And I would say it is enacted and continues to be on the books in many different states in the way of blue laws, of Sabbath laws. If you've been following our disputes, we've been proponents of Sabbath laws. A restoration of the Sabbath is the most concrete and material gift that we can give to our nation. Secondly, a restoration of a realist view of the common good. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then to discuss very briefly the problem with foul liturgies and foul altars that are defiling our country, and the need for spiritual restoration. So first, the threat of materialism. Where does the threat of materialism come from in our country? We'll use liberalism as our shorthand, but a liberal vision of society has a principle of separation at its heart. I think Professor Papin said that earlier, quoting Pierre Manant. Separation, you might say, is a first-order principle of liberalism. Separation is a first-order principle. And what does it separate us from? It separates us first from the church, and it separates us from God. What we see, of course, most famously in left liberal materialism, for example, is not simply just a kind of atheist materialism, but like a post-Christian rebellion against Christendom. A post-Christian rebellion against God and especially the image of God. And like all materialists in every age, they become destroyers of the good. They enact what my friend Ed Feser calls perfect world disorder. They lack any coherent explanation for spiritual or physical evils or for the cause of the goodness of creation. And so precisely because they are human, precisely because they're rational, precisely because they're relational, and precisely because they're religious, they cannot help but to be religious about their materialism. And this inevitably becomes darkly Gnostic. Unfortunately, like the medieval Albigensians, they're everywhere and they have power. And we must oppose them. And how must we oppose them? We must oppose them with power. We must oppose them with authority. Why? Because they threaten violence. They threaten violence not only against ourselves, but against our children, against poor people sitting on porches waiting for mills to return. They threaten the integrity of our country, our world, and they threaten the integrity of our church, which in its earthly parts is constantly battered by precisely the corrosive dimensions of this liberalism. Equally, there can be no serious right liberal response to the threat of left liberal materialism. There can be no serious right liberal response because you can't respond to left liberalism with liberalism. This is why we describe our predicament in the descriptive mode as post-liberal. Left liberals are post-Christian in a second sense. Not only the sense of the principle of separation, that they separate themselves from God and His church, but post in the sense that they're parasitic on Christendom. They come after it and seek to do what it did, but in an inverted way, like Emperor Julian, the apostate, who tried to replace the church's charity with his own version of bread and circuses. That is to say that our left liberal materialists are instructive on one level, and we should pay attention to how they work, because they've actually retained certain structural aspects of Christendom. They actually care about things like solidarity, even in their rebellion. They recognize that the nation needs, for example, common worship. That's why you may have seen in many, many places a brand new flag flying over many buildings. New flags, new symbols, new objects, new liturgies of a common faith and a common worship. The judicial precepts must be held together with the ceremonial precepts of the natural law in a political community, and nature abhors a vacuum, and they have rushed in with a new civic religion. After the collapse of mainline Protestantism, they have effectively planted a flag of new faith on a foul altar. Just as right liberals retain an interest in the principle of subsidiarity, but often invert its meaning, so do left liberals retain the material aspects of the classical and Christian view of the common good. And this is what gives them much of their religious fire for community building, for group identity, for full state support for the material goods necessary for their constructed view of what the common good is. By saying constructed view of the common good, I already mean to point out that they disorder it. They, along with right liberals, have a distorted view of what the common good is, one which is also built on the principle of separation. Principle of separation being a first-order value. For liberalism, they treat the common good as cut off from the principle of its cause and end in God. This is what makes them unwitting accomplices in the destruction of our American good. So here I want to propose, as a bulwark, as a make-weight, as a condition for addressing material questions in a non-materialist way, our political commitment to God as a people, as the source and end of our good, and as the only intelligible way of making sense of the American good. A public orientation to God then reflected where? Reflected in concrete ways, in national holidays, in civic liturgies, in laws, indeed, Sabbath laws, Sunday laws that would require a cessation of what? Commerce. A cessation of all that commerce, of that Mac boondoggle or whatever that was delivered by that 75-year-old man on the door of the Papin residence on a Sunday morning, could cease, and we could be free for one day, for God, for the debt that we owe to Him. For we are first and foremost debtors to God. We are first and foremost debtors to God. I think of some of our donors in this room who have taught me that. Secondly, this public ordination to God points us precisely to the way that it is in the very nature of goodness to communicate itself to us, to be made common. And in the Catholic vision, this sharing of the common good is precisely the way in which our personal goods are elevated. Sabbath laws are a way of publicly orienting us to God, but also safeguarding the common good of the family, the common good of the sacrament of the family, marriage, the common good of local communities, the common good of, indeed, Holy Church. And the state, in making such laws, sets a limit. Itself must set the limit. The state itself must set the limit on a burned-out materialism that leaves us sad on porches, waiting for things that we should not wait for, reducing us all to the cogs of capital machinery is not what we should hope for. Pope Leo's Rerum Novarum directed that wages be determined not primarily in terms of what the market will bear, because the market is really just an aggregate of private goods in exchange, but rather a just wage should be determined according to the common good of the family. This is extraordinarily anti-materialist, and yet profoundly interested in material questions of justice that have typically been taken over by left liberals, but which they inevitably distort because of their Frankenstein-like view of the common good. In 1943, the philosopher Charles de Koninck argued powerfully against the liberal view of the common good. He argued against modern individualists who believed the common good was something alien to us, something secondary to us. De Koninck sought to recover an older classical Catholic view of the primacy of the common good as a bulwark against both materialist individualism and communism alike. The human person, in a sense, is not the most basic political unit, but rather we would say the family is. As Professor Hahn noted, by saying that the family is the most basic political good, we affirm that primacy of the common good, that we're relational beings, that we're made for communion. The individualist or personalist sought to oppose totalitarianism or fascism, types of materialism, by positing that the person is the substantial whole. But de Koninck argued that in doing so, they adopted a version of the totalitarian notion of state they claimed to thwart. Why? Because totalitarian regimes are nothing other than a more powerful singular to singulars, which are purely and simply subjected. The primacy of the person then makes the common good something alien, something foreign to us, and simultaneously requires that the people be held together by a more powerful singular. And this is precisely how left liberals think about the common good. De Koninck concluded that this was the result of a certain accommodation with liberalism, rather than remaining true to classical metaphysical realism. The personalists unwittingly authored a vision of the commons that simply replicated the liberal view of a collection of rights bearers who remain perpetually in conflict, a war of all against all, needing constant adjudication and a dictatorial power to keep it together. De Koninck concluded that left and right liberals each erred then in seeing the common good as a mere aggregate. In seeing that the common good is just the private good, you deracinate the very idea. This is not a society of free men, he wrote, but of tyrants. And thus the entire people become like one tyrant who lead each other by force into devastation. This reinforces, I think, then, the need for a public orientation to God, because once you have a public orientation to God, you can begin to think about how all the goods flow from God and must return to God. This, I think, is actually in our American tradition. Maybe not always in the most fulsome Catholic sense, but it is there. The very early habit of referring to states as commonwealths, the habit of early American municipalities before and after the Constitution appealing to the common good as something objective, something that we don't manipulate and control, but something that is whole and indivisible and which all can share, something which gave order and unity to the parts. That is not the first order principle of separation, but the principle of unity, the principle of the common good as something which gives order and the tranquility of peace to parts, something in which every citizen could participate and whose participation in the familial and the civic common good would make them better and more virtuous. This metaphysically thick vision of the common good, I think, at least turns us in the right direction for restoration. Another way of thinking about our material conditions in a non-materialist way, then, is to reject the liberal vision, to be post-liberal in this sense, that we reject the liberal aggregate view and embrace a metaphysically realist view. The best way to protect individuals from the abuses of private interest is not to create other associations of private interest. The best way to protect the person from the abuses of private interest, from the abuses of personal and corporate greed, is to think about the good of the whole, not the competing rights and interests of the parts. Finally, I want to say a word about our civic altars and liturgies, and whether it really has to be this way, whether we need to fly the rainbow flag rather than the American flag. Civic religion, of course, is natural to our nature. As Thomas teaches in the Treatise on Law, to become a citizen of a country, one needs common worship. The ceremonial precepts of the natural law are natural to polities, as Fustel de Coulanges argued. Civic religion precedes our founding. We see it in the very names of our cities, the fact that we have cities called San Diego, Sacramento, San Francisco, and Los Angeles on the West Coast, St. Louis in the middle, San Antonio in the south, St. Augustine, I suppose, on the East Coast. All those names remind us that much of America was founded with a self-conscious vision of the right civic altar, with civic altars that were rightly oriented, not foul altars. Literally, cities which are constitutively liturgical and seek heavenly intercessions and aid the graces of God even in their names. This was also true for Protestant parts of the country, even if their civic altars were differently ordered. Even if their civic altars were not specifically tied to the communion of saints, our Constitution is a federal system which sought, of course, to respect these civic altars. But now we have foul ones. Today, America has foul altars which still work on the principle of separation. Foul altars which do not make us friends. Foul altars which do not unite us to the graces of God. Foul altars which cannot unite us to any common good and cannot help those men on their porches who are hoping for a better world. Foul altars which indeed require child sacrifice, the mutilation of genitals, the destruction of the image of God and the union of male and female, husband and wife. Altars which detach us on the principle of separation from real goods, which can raise us up precisely in order to make us better market consumers. These are the altars that must be crushed in the way that Theodosius crushed foul altars, in the way that Constantine helped the church by state support. Theodosius helped the church by crushing foul altars, which brought great impurity to Rome. And we have that same duty, I think, as Catholics who are political by nature, to pull down those ramparts. Thank you very much.
Start with capitalism. As Karl Polanyi documented in his historical study, that classic, The Great Transformation, capitalism invades and reorganizes traditional forms of life in accord with market principles. And there are two lines of arguments in the 20th century favoring the imperial ambitions of capitalism. The most common is utilitarian. As Friedrich Hayek claimed, markets allocate resources more efficiently than do central planners. But more important to him was what he regarded as the moral superiority of the price mechanism. He argued that markets maximize freedom by organizing society in a non-coercive way. And Milton Friedman puts this claim at the center of his extremely influential book from the early 1960s, Capitalism and Freedom. Now, Hayek and Friedman's argument for the moral superiority of capitalism has certainly, as we know, captured the imagination of many. But it is ever falsified by experience. The notion of the wage slave bespeaks a truth about the life of asset-poor workers in a modern capitalist society. And of course, because capitalism hones in, the price mechanism hones in on satisfying our desires, an ever-expanding market does the opposite of what the classical tradition counsels. Rather than encouraging the discipline of our wants as the only path to lasting freedom, it stokes those wants, and we sell ourselves into slavery to a worldly regime of sin and death in exactly the way that St. Paul bemoans. No, so as we see, capitalism makes both alluring promises of prosperity and freedom and produces many forms of bondage and many pathologies. And the implications of this double quality of capitalism has had the implications of this double quality of capitalism for modern political economy has, I think, been twofold. One trajectory of modern political economy has concentrating on removing the limits on market transactions. The suppression of guilds, for example, as an instance of this in the early modern period. Or to empower market participants. Think of the limited liability corporation as a legal instrument that empowers market participants. Or by mobilizing natural and labor resources. I think the repeal of the poor laws in England in the early 19th century allowed for a greater mobilization of labor power to serve a modern capitalism. But the other trajectory of modern political economy has sought to limit capitalism's imperial ambitions and to counter the new forms of bondage that capitalism creates. Obviously, America's generous tax treatment of charitable donations is meant to nurture endeavors and institutions that are not governed by the profit motive. Our labor laws seek to protect workers from exploitation, which they cannot avoid simply by exercising their nominal free choice not to work. Tariffs and industrial policy aim to secure non-market goods of solidarity and national security. Parks cordon off land, and environmental laws work to protect the public commons. Now, I share Polanyi's anti-utopian view that the give and take between these two aspects of modern political economy can be avoided. I think it's inevitable that there be an element of encouragement of the productive and prosperity-creating elements of capitalism in tandem with efforts to constrain, limit, and remediate the damage done by capitalism. And so every generation must rethink and redraw the laws that both encourage and restrain commercial life, as well as to ensure that its costs and benefits are equitably distributed. After a long season of ideological slumber induced by the utopian belief that markets are self-correcting and self-limiting, we on the right, on the American right, very much need to do that rethinking and redrawing of laws. As an aside here, I think it's intellectually dishonest for those on the right to speak of policies that limit or guide markets in the interests of the common good as somehow an unprecedented government intervention. Or, and this mindless epithet is often used by those who wish to sustain free market utopianism as so-called conservative social engineering. Polanyi shows that the triumph of capitalism required a long series of political efforts. The WTO, in my own lifetime, the WTO and the other pillars of today's global economy were constructed by governments, not by the market. Government action and capitalism have always, from the very outset, been intertwined. But even though economic policies are important and redrawing our laws to limit capitalism in all sorts of ways are necessary, it is the case that societies grappling with the disruption and damage done by capitalism have also emphasized what might be called a cultural politics, a kind of spiritual warfare in a sense, and not just a legal warfare. As the founders of our country recognized in the design of our federal government, dangerous powers and imperial ambitions can be limited by countervailing powers and countervailing ambitions. And it's my conviction that this method of limiting capitalism is of the utmost importance. Now, obviously, and we've heard from our other presenters, the family and the church are forces capable of keeping modern capitalism within limits. To them, I would add the nation, and I think our other speakers have adverted to that as well. It's a more ambiguous counterforce, but an important one nevertheless. All three are what I call love societies. They ask for our loyalty, and they promise rewards that cannot be bought or sold. Family life is not organized by the price mechanism. Parents who give their children tokens at age 6 and then allocate chores, presents, and even affection on the basis of daily auctions are rightly deemed dangerous ideologues. The nation demands sacrifices and promises, and it promises honor, and both are perverted when they are given a market price. Certainly, one of the great perversions of the Civil War was the possibility of wealthy people to buy out of the draft by paying for a substitute. The church is, and then I think about, the Stephen Schwartzman Public Library on Fifth Avenue across from my office. It's the Central Library, beautiful building built in 1910. And why is it the Stephen Schwartzman? He donated a great deal of money. It used to be you had to be dead before they would name a building after you. Now, if you donate enough money, it's right away. So honor and sacrifice are given market prices, but they pervert those, both the sacrifices called for and the honor bestowed. And the church, of course, is even more remote from market logic. The church's central promise is that in Christ, we can attain the pearl of great price, a treasure that is in heaven and not in this world. Now, we need to use political power to renew and strengthen these non-market love societies. So let me start with the nations. Let me just walk through nation, family, and church. Think about how we can use political action to strengthen these love societies. Let me start with the nation. Or perhaps the better term for my purposes right now is the word heritage. It's a more nebulous notion, I agree, but it could be useful. Today, the tearing down of statues denudes the public square. Nothing is raised to replace the toppled monuments. To my mind, the void is emblematic of our age. The ideology of multiculturalism functions as did enclosure laws centuries ago in England that created private property rights over what was once common use land. This multiculturalism strips away our cultural commons, making society more fully available for reorganization by market principles. Starbucks and Netflix will fill the void left where Robert E. Lee is removed. It's no surprise, therefore, that economic neoliberalism embraces progressive cultural fashions. So what to do about the nation? To be frank, I tire of playing anti-woke defense 24/7. So I'll propose a proactive policy to combat the submergence of our country into the logic of capitalism, because I think that's the real problem here, and not, I think critical race theory is both false and damaging, but the real deeper danger is the way it clears the way for submerging our country under the logic of capitalism. So here's a proposal. Let's require military service for those young people who, at the present, are regarded as the most economically valuable young people in our nation. So let's say 2 years, no, let's make it 4 years of mandatory military service for all graduates of universities rated in the top 50 universities in U.S. News and World Reports. Maybe that's unrealistic, but we do need to think about policies that will rescue aspects of our national culture from the logic of the market. Family. Here the situation is dire. Fertility rates have plummeted. Out-of-wedlock births are the norm, or nearly so, in many parts of society. As a consequence, the young are being reared by history's most powerful marketing tool, the smartphone. I'd venture that a child who has any restrictions at all on screen usage, of those children who get restrictions on screen usage, 99% are living with their mother and their father. Without the discipline of family life, we are abandoned to the marketplace, which now has the technological means to make us 24/7 consumers. Now, this is not a panel on family policy, so I won't offer detailed proposals. Look to Gladden Pappin for that. But let me say that half measures at this juncture will not do. We need a dramatic change in course when it comes to family policy in the United States. Something along the lines of significantly decreasing taxes for married couples with children, and perhaps increasing Social Security benefits in accord with how many children you have. We really need to think and really make some bold proposals here. The situation is dire. The church. Here I think the situation is more promising. The cultural deregulation that has worked in tandem with economic deregulation succeeded in severely damaging the family. But it has not damaged American religious institutions nearly so much. Nominal Christianity has certainly declined in our country, but church attendance remains at roughly the same levels as it has been for decades. In fact, I talked to Chris Smith, the sociologist at Notre Dame, and he thinks it's been basically 25% of Americans go to church on Sunday, and it's been that way for more than 100 years, and it's still that way. Put simply, the committed core of Christians endures as a political and cultural force in American society. And our endurance explains why the efforts to curtail religious liberty have failed, and that a doctrinaire wall of separation approach has been rolled back by the courts. You know, the courts like to think that they protect unpopular minorities. No. They protect popular minorities, as any Mormon will tell you in the history of the Mormon Church. In view of the continuing vitality of our religious institutions, our goal should be to empower them politically and culturally. Schemes to secure state funding for religious schools need to be advanced, for example. I also have advocated in other instances overturning the school prayer cases from the early 1960s to allow for the restoration of ecumenical prayer in public schools. And then Chad Pecknold has just urged us to think about how to fence in the Sabbath, or at least fence commerce out on the Sabbath. Again, we live in a very diverse country, but there are things that are possible, and often what stands in the way is really a legacy of hostility to religious institutions that took hold in our jurisprudence after the Second World War. Let me conclude by noting that America once had an integralist tradition until various Supreme Court decisions dismantled some of its main supports. It was a Protestant-dominated, theologically vague, and politically soft integralism that some may deem ersatz and therefore not authentically integralist. I'm happy to concede the use of the term to those who advance purer views. But I believe that if we hope to restrain capitalism, then we must sift through the American tradition of state encouragement of the virtue of religion, and there is a long tradition of state encouragement of the virtue of religion, in order to discern what can be fruitfully restored in our own time. In conclusion, nation, family, and church. These are bulwarks against the financialization of everything. We need to use the art of politics to renew and strengthen these loved societies. Thank you.